handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seattle. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seattle.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4-7 tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds AGPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience. Very happy to have Daniel Ortner with us with the Pacific Legal Foundation. They do just remarkable work, and it's just so much fun hearing about some real legal heroes, lawyers that are heroes, I would say, that help out the little guy. And Pacific Legal Foundation really does that. And some of the cases that come into their offices are really quite remarkable. So Daniel is with us because we have a situation here. We're back to First Amendment stuff here, Mr. Daniel, aren't we? Welcome to the Denise Simon Experience, by the way.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. Yep, that's right.
Yeah. I was whining to Tim Snowball the other day that everything that seems to come across my desk is First Amendment, and we just don't seem to. I mean, it is, isn't it?
Well, it really is. We have First Amendment is a hot topic right now in the news. I mean, following the shootings and other events, there's always talk about censoring speech. It's kind of the hot button thing that people progressives tend to go to, is wanting to silence those they disagree with ultimately. And so I think speech is going to always be a hot issue.
And we don't fight back. You guys fight back, but we don't understand how to fight back out here. We just kind of go, oh, we're not allowed to say that. Okay. And so we go to self-censoring, and then corporations are doing that. Government is doing it, but you've got an interesting thing that's happening here in New York. Help us with this one.
Sure. So this is, I wrote an op-ed in the Hill this last week about a decision in the Second Circuit. So this is about a company called Vugo. They're a tech startup. They work with Uber drivers and Lyft drivers and rideshare operators to install tablets in the backseat of the vehicle. The tablet plays some low volume advertisements during the ride. It also helps. It provides shows ads for local deals for the customers. It gives customers options to tip the drivers, which Uber, their app doesn't allow you to tip the driver. So drivers really benefit when the customers have a good way to tip the driver if they have a good service. So these tablets, they really help the drivers out because the drivers are not getting a lot of money from driving Uber. They're working lots of hours to just get by, and so this is an extra way they make $100 or so extra a month from the ad revenue. So it's a good business model for the driver. It's a minimal inconvenience for the customer, and ultimately the customer could benefit by costs being lowered if these go into place, because the driver and the company can charge less from the customer if they're getting some ad revenue to compensate for it. So it ultimately benefits the customer and the driver and this company. But the city of New York has decided their taxi commission has decided to banning advertisements in Ubers and Lyfts. All the while, it allows those yellow cabs to have the taxi TVs that everyone who's been to New York despises. And so this company Vugo challenged this ban on First Amendment grounds. Unfortunately, they won at the district court. Unfortunately, the Second Circuit recently decided that this ban is constitutional under the First Amendment, because they say the government can ban commercial speech more with a laxer burden than banning non-commercial speech, and that satisfies some minimal governmental interest.
Oh, wait. Now we're defining what kind of speech? Commercial speech?
Yeah, this has been the case for a long time. It's something that Pacific Legal has fought very strongly against. There's been a doctrine that commercial speech is less valuable. So if you're selling something, your speech is not as valuable as if you're a politician, advertising your campaign, or if you're doing any other kind of issue speech. If it's selling something, it's less valuable. And I think part of the reason that this is so problematic is that the line between commercial and non-commercial speech has just gotten more and more unclear. You think about some of the big commercial ads that have gotten a lot of media attention, like the Gillette ad, for instance, or Colin Kaepernick, a Nike ad, which started a firestorm. These advertisements are more and more touching on political and social issues, and politics is in some ways more and more resembling commercial transactions. When the Democrats are now saying, give me $1 to get me into the debates. It's very commercial in some ways, and so the line between commercial and political speech is just so much blurrier today. So it makes no sense for the government to make this distinction, and then it allows something like what's happening in New York, where the government is giving protect status, or protecting a favored industry, which is the taxi industry in this case.
I mean, why don't but they would be okay if they put in, some kind of Wi-Fi so they could broadcast CNN in the taxis or Ubers, I guess, right?
Right. It's really strange. I mean, the driver can talk about whatever he wants, about politics.
Yeah.
Not Uber and Lyft would have a problem with it. Like they might stop working with that driver, contracting with that driver. If they got reports of someone talking about politics, but there's nothing in New York saying that. There's nothing against blasting the radio really loudly, as far as I know. So it's very quaint kind of interest. They're saying, well, these ads are going to annoy people, and people can't be annoyed while they're in transit, and therefore we're going to ban this form of speech. And really, that shouldn't be enough for the city to ban speech.
How do they know it's going to annoy anybody? They got some kind of a crystal ball here that they know it's going to annoy somebody? Right. How do they know that? Having these ads and maybe a little annoying and maybe a little inconvenient, but I think most people realize this is something you can just ignore if you don't want to watch an advertisement. And then they also would offer things like Netflix or YouTube streaming on these tablets, so it might be enjoyable for the person in the vehicle if they're stuck in traffic in New York City for 20 minutes trying to go down a couple blocks, which happens very frequently in New York City. They could stream a YouTube video on this tablet. So it offers, maybe annoys some, but it offers a benefit to others. And ultimately, the government, you think about New York City. If you're walking on the street, you have people haranguing you for money. You have giant billboards that are 100 feet in the air. It's this idea that we need to protect people from being annoyed just in this one space. I think is very quaint and outdated, and should not be seen as a legitimate government interest in this case, or especially not an important government interest, which is what the standard is. We get annoyed listening to ads on radio. We get annoyed watching ads on TV, but it's something that we've come to accept, and so it's there. It's part of, I guess, our culture. But Here's New York trying to predict that everybody's going to be annoyed.
Right. I mean, think about what happens with let's say, Hulu. If you have a subscription to Hulu, you can buy a lower tier subscription, which you have ads and it's cheaper, or you can pay more to have an ad-free experience. So it allows customers to have the freedom to decide, how annoyed am I, and am I willing to pay more to not have advertisements. And that means customers that don't care about ads, they don't annoy me when I'm watching Hulu, if every once in a while I have 30 seconds or a minute or two of ads, then I get pay less for what I want. And that model really works in a free market system. That's, with Uber or Lyft, maybe that might happen. The driver could offer the customer reduced rates if they have this ad device, or the normal rate if they don't, and that just offers more user choice ultimately.
So what is this? Is this a state government thing? Is this a city government thing? It's
a city. It's they have a state agency, a city agency that regulates taxi medallions and driving services like Uber and Lyft. They're already very controlling, very
regulated.
Very regulated. I mean, taxis are extremely regulated in New York, and that's part of why Uber and Lyft were so successful in New York City, because taxis had been stagnant for so long under the kind of government. The medallions were very expensive, and there was very much a monopoly to get into it. And so Uber and Lyft really came in and really disrupted things very powerfully in New York City. They forced taxis to modernize. That's actually why. So the taxi TVs came about because taxis were required to install credit card payment devices, partially to compete with ride shares and just to offer convenience to customers. And then they installed these TVs as part of the remodel of the vehicles. So that's how these taxi TVs came about. So now the city says, well, we have to allow them to get their money back for the installations they had to make. My reaction is, well, that means Uber and Lyft are competitive. They're offering something that they're competing, and you don't have to install a device into your vehicle. That's an upside. You shouldn't punish them because they offer a benefit, technological benefit to drivers, that they just can use an app and they don't have to install a device, by not allowing them to have access to ad revenue that the taxis have access to.
So who's really being sued here? The city?
Yeah, this is against the city, the city's.
Is it like a port authority or the transit authority, or what? I mean,
it's a taxi commission. It's the transit and taxi. Yes, it's the transportation. Well, I guess the city of New York is the defendant in the case, but then there's the Taxi Limousine Commission is the agency that's responsible. They sued the city on behalf of against the actions of the Taxi and Limousine Commission.
Do Uber and Lyft, and I'm sure there's going to be more. Do they have to pay some kind of a fee to somebody or some kind of an application in order to be able to even offer Uber and Lyft drivers the ability to do Uber and Lyft driving?
I suspect it's very much city by city, and some cities are going to increasingly try to do that. I know with airports, they often have some kind of a commission or a charge for drivers and for Uber and Lyft. So I don't know specifically how much it costs in New York. I'm pretty sure that there is some kind of a charge.
But I mean, is there a stipulation in that? I mean, is there an application process where there's a stipulation that's already had put out some, you can't do this and you can't do that, but you must do this and you must do that? I mean, are there some kind of those conditions?
Yeah, well, the Taxi Limousine Commission has pretty extensive regulations for everything at the moment.
And did it include any kind of advertising or any kind of streaming ads or something?
Well, this has been in place for a little bit. There's been this carve out for the taxis.
Okay.
So it's been in place for a while. It's not a new restriction, but it's one that now is being challenged because these companies have the technology's improved and people are trying to offer this experience. Really, I think this is just another example of cities, lashing out against innovation. We see this with short-term rental restrictions. Right now, all across the country, cities are enacting these restrictions. Latest is Jersey City, just across the Hudson from Manhattan. For a couple of years ago, they were welcoming short-term rentals, and they said, we want Airbnb, we want these other companies to come here and people to host. And then they passed just recently a restriction saying, no, we are cracking down, and now it's very, very regulated. You have to pay fees. You have to only have a certain number of units, only can rent them a certain number of days. There's really just this backlash and this fear of change. People just want to preserve things the way they are, and resisting change and resisting market forces. And it's hurting ultimately consumers. It hurts people who benefit from these services.
Daniel, this reminds me of a case that I had talked to. I think it was the Washington, D.C. Archdiocese back in, I don't know, a couple of years ago. Because they had wanted to put up some banners, not very big ones, in the D.C. metro system.
Christmas ad?
Yeah, that just said, find the perfect gift.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And all it had was it had the three wise men, and there in a couple of stars in the sky. There nothing about Christmas, nothing about Catholicism, and
another strange case where in that context the ads on the subway are considered a government forum or not a public forum, and so the government can restrict the kind of ads you can put on there. And there it's the opposite. They can say we only want commercial ads, no religious, no political ads, which is also should be deeply troubling when you're saying, well, the Sears can advertise and Macy's can advertise and Gap can advertise, but a church cannot advertise and the Red Cross cannot advertise.
But there's nothing in the ad. I'm looking at it, findtheperfectgift.org. There was nothing in there about a church. There was nothing in there about a steeple or a cross. Anything.
Yeah, this is somewhat similar to the case that I think I might have spoken to you about several months ago about in Boston about the Christian flag not being allowed to be flown on a flagpole, which was open to other groups. And unfortunately, the First Circuit also upheld Boston's actions under similar grounds. It's the government creates the forum and they can define the limits of it. But when you're doing things like saying no religious imagery, no Christian flags. I think that is some kind of speech, viewpoint conduct where you're saying, we don't like this viewpoint, we don't like these views being expressed, and so that shouldn't be protected. It shouldn't be allowed. The First Amendment should more stringently protect that kind of speech. That's what we're arguing for, and we argued in our amicus in that case and elsewhere, is that when the government is basically choosing sides, choosing favorites, like we like this kind of expression and we don't like that kind of expression, that should be subject to strict scrutiny. The government should have to have a compelling reason to do so, and it shouldn't be able to just restrict speech unless it's the only alternative. There's no other option for achieving what the government wants to do.
This is becoming a systemic problem because, we've got two senators, and I'm reminded that actually three. I think we've got Kamala Harris, Mazie Hirono, and Dianne Feinstein. They're part of the Judicial Committee, and we're trying to confirm these judges, and some of these judges are Catholic. Some of them are actually members of Knights of Columbus,
right.
And they're virtually attacking them in the questioning and their confirmation about being a member of the Knights of Columbus.
Yeah, it's really disturbing. I think it's part of a greater societal trend where we everything is politicized. Where we shop, what we listen to, what we watch, what we do. Everything is so politically charged nowadays. And so, if what church you went to was off limits. It used to be that what you did in your spare time, if you went watched a show, shopped in a certain place, was not part of the conversation. And now everything is political. Everything is politicized.
So if we trot back to New York and we do some religious ads in the taxis, that would really blow their minds, wouldn't it?
If you did what? Oh, religious ads.
If religious ads, streaming religious TV in the taxi. That would just really blow their mind, wouldn't it?
That's right. Although it'd be interesting because in that case, the First Amendment would be more protective, probably, of the religious speech than the commercial speech because of this.
Well, there you go. There's a good argument for you.
Well, actually, in this case, it's actually interesting because these, the tablets, they wanted to also display occasionally, allow political campaigns to buy ads on there. They also wanted to allow public service ads, like ads saying, go get your colon cancer screening if you're over the age 65. They want to have all of those things advertised. So the city, though, is treating it, all those things like, just as restrictively as commercial speech. But the Second Circuit, I don't think, unfortunately, didn't see it that way. So we'll see. The company Vugo is appealing for an en banc review on the second circuit. So hopefully,
and explain en banc. I know what it is, but for the listeners, explain en banc.
So usually on a court of appeals, three judges, a panel of three judges hear any particular case. But there are a lot more judges on that court that don't hear the case. So when you seek en banc review, that's just the fancy kind of Latin word for it on
everybody.
The whole. So
everybody.
All of the judges of that court. Or I think in the Ninth Circuit, they have so many that the en banc, even en banc is not actually everyone. It's a subset, but it's much bigger. But in the Second Circuit, it would be all of the judges of the court would rehear the case essentially if they accept it. And I think that I imagine that if that's denied, and those are often denied. Most courts of appeal only hear a small handful of en banc cases a year. The Third Circuit, where I clerked, there was an average of 2 or 3 a year. A very, very small number of cases are heard en banc. If that's denied, then I imagine that the company is going to try to appeal up to the Supreme Court, and hopefully, I hope they really raise the issue of why is commercial speech being treated differently. A lot of justices in the Supreme Court have said, no, this doesn't make any sense. Justice Thomas and others have very powerfully argued that this restriction on commercial speech does not make sense. So I'm really hoping that they will ask the Supreme Court to review that question. Why is commercial speech being treated differently than other kinds of speech? Why is it seen as less valuable? It is truthful, informative, useful speech for people, just as political speech is, just as religious speech is, and it should be protected just the same by the First Amendment. And that's what we've been, for years arguing, and we're going to continue to advocate for until hopefully one day the Supreme Court takes that up and overturns the precedent, which says this speech is lesser, it's less valuable, it's less protected.
And so, the Supreme Court is on vacation right now, correct?
Yeah, this is the in-between terms. That's right.
Right. So they don't come back until what, October 1st?
October, yeah. Early October, yeah. So the way it works is people are going to be filing petitions over the summer.
Yeah. So they're going to come back to a whole stack of stuff.
Come back, they have a whole stack of petitions. They're going to have a lot of conference, the long conference is called, where they review a lot of these petitions. And then if they grant it, it gets argued. It will depend on when they grant it, but if they grant it in October, it'll probably be argued sometime in the spring or sometime later in the term.
Typically, when they come back and they look at all these petitions, are they looking at a couple of hundred when they come back?
There are thousands of petitions every year. Yeah, I don't know the latest numbers, but there are thousands.
Thousands.
A lot of petitions. There's a lot of petitions. I don't know how many are going to be in the stack.
Right.
Yeah, but they get a lot of cert petitions.
I guess they could bundle some of them. Look at some of them and bundle them.
Well, there's 7,000 to 8,000 each term.
Wow. I had no idea.
It'll probably be several thousand. So, some of them they can get dismissed pretty quickly. The way it works on the Supreme Court is that every justice, the clerks, most of the justices have a pool where they all circulate a memo. Like one justice will circulate a memo about a case, and then the others will read that memo. And so not every justice looks at every case as closely. Although some don't participate in that. Alito and I think Gorsuch don't participate in that cert pool. Their clerks review every case. So it's a lot of work, especially for those.
We like to know the little back details like you just shared. That's fascinating. I had no idea that was the volume. No idea.
It's a lot. They only hear about 80 cases.
I thought so.
A year. So it's a very small number get heard, and so. But this is an issue. This issue of commercial speech and whether it's treated differently has been one that the courts kind of put off for a long time. Whenever they have a case which raises the issue, they won't decide it. They'll decide on some other grounds. They'll say, well, we don't need to decide this because even if it's commercial speech, it's still, this law is still unconstitutional, or some other reason to not resolve this question or reconsider it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Daniel Ortner. This will be fascinating to learn. So thank you for sharing with us. And a hat tip to Pacific Legal Foundation for sure.
Yeah, no problem.
And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way. So stay with us.
Thanks for having me.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience, heard worldwide on Mojo 50. You know, I've traveled a lot of places in my life and crossed paths with a lot of really cool, famous people, but this next one that we have as a guest, Stephen Coontz, is probably going to be on the very top of my list. I never thought that I would get the distinct pleasure of having a best-selling author, Stephen Coontz, with us. Stephen, I think you're an overachiever.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. Somebody.
I do. I mean, you were a naval pilot and a lawyer, and obviously a very accomplished author. I might have a little bit of connective tissue with you because I saw that you were aboard at one point in your Navy career, CVN 65. And I had a cousin who was the captain of the USS Enterprise, but I don't think you were on board at the same time. But congratulations on this newest book, The Russia Account. I think people are somewhat overwhelmed with the topic of Russia, but here's the fascinating thing, and you, I think, have honed in your skills on this, is whatever you hear about Russia, it's probably true, correct?
Indeed. There's a lot that's been said about Russia and a lot that's true, but, you know, it really hit the national conscience and it got everybody's attention after the 2016 election and, you know, the so-called Russian dossier and all this stuff. And the ridiculous charge that the Russians had in effect caused Donald Trump to win the election. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I don't think that's been proven. In fact, it's been there was no conspiracy whatsoever. But there's no doubt the Russians were indeed, you know, funding Facebook ads and doing their nasty little business to try to get people to vote in the way they wanted.
Well, clearly headlines, however twisted some of them may be, headlines, there's some truth to them, and because of headlines in the United States dealing with Russia, I would argue your newest book, The Russia Account, can almost write itself. We just need you to put the pieces together for us in a suspense thriller, right?
Well, that's what I hope that people will think. But I need to tell you, Denise, that this book was suggested by a real event that happened about 2 years ago. And I read about it in the Wall Street Journal, and it's been subsequently reported on by national news and so on. And that is that a small branch of the Danske Bank, now that's a Danish bank, located in Tallinn, Estonia. This is a tiny little branch bank of a major multinational bank, had 240 billion, that's billion with a B, dollars run through it in 4 years. And it all came out of Russia and then was transferred to shell corporations all over the world. And there disappeared into the world's financial system. And who ended up with it? Their authorities are still trying to figure that out. And anyway, the Danske Bank subsequently closed that branch, and there's no doubt that some financial shenanigans were going on, whether it was money laundering or something else, because $240 billion is an unbelievably large sum. You know, we've seen money laundering of drug money go on through various banks, especially in the Caribbean, but it never got beyond a few $100 million. You know, the drug business is profitable, but it isn't that profitable, over $100 billion a year. And so where did all this money come from? Well, even more interesting, where did it go? And we do know that it came out of Russia. So anyway, I got busy and I dreamed up answers to all these questions and wrote a novel. And I called it Satan's Army, sent it to my publisher, and I got a call from them, and they said, we want to change the title. Russia is in the news. Everything Russian is hot. You know, if we put Russia on the title, people will break a leg trying to get into the bookstore to buy it. And swine that I am, I caved, and so that's the Russia account.
But, you know, as you said, there is a true event that happened. So I wonder with this little dance bank, if our friend Bill Browder of the Magnitsky Act has been on top of this one, because I clearly think that he probably has. He has been looking for illicit Russian dollars leaving Russia, belonging to Vladimir Putin, to far corners of the globe, including some that we found because of the Panama Papers. So, Stephen, you've got an awful lot of material. I mean, you do. All you have to do is just pick up a newspaper or, you know, look at a particular, trailer going across the TV. And it's gotten to the point, too, where we don't know what to believe. And so I would say that in all of your best-selling books, including the Russia account, that sometimes the Russians don't even know whether to believe themselves, right?
Well, I think that's the case. Obviously, in Russia, the right hand rarely knows what the left hand is up to, and vice versa. And, you have various intelligence agencies, and they're out there making life miserable for people all over the world. And so, and they're not going to admit it. And so this is a wonderful villain or villains, a wonderful cast of rogues to use in fiction. And a friend of mine sent me a story about the problem the Poles are currently having. Mm-hmm. It seems that a group of Polish politicians like to meet in a private room at a restaurant and let their hair down and drink too much and say what they really thought about the problems in the country and, all that stuff. But what they didn't know was that the Russians had bugged the room. And the Russian spy service then released all that, and the government collapsed in Poland. And so, these guys are nasty. And not saying that we don't do the same thing, but still, there's a lot of stuff there you can throw at the Russians.
Well, that's exactly right. What's particularly fascinating about you and your books is that you have certainly your own experience as a military in the Navy, so you can bring some other realms of reality to these thrillers. So I would suggest that maybe because you have these suspense thrillers, that probably 90% of them have 90% truth to them.
Well,
did I crack the code?
I work hard at what somebody called verisimilitude, and what I call the aura of reality. We want to make it give you enough that it seems real and that it could be plausible. And so, armed with that, we're off spinning a tale that never happened, and it is fiction, and it's popular fiction. And, I'm not going to win a book award, but hopefully I'll keep you entertained on a weekend or an afternoon at the beach or whatever.
I only got the book yesterday, Stephen, so I haven't had a chance to read it. In fact, it didn't get to me till around 4 p.m. And in the meantime, we have so many other things in the headlines. But your thrillers certainly, with your imagination, cause the reader to have an imagination, and that imagination then. Oftentimes, if you look at events like the recent events here in the last couple of days of the Russian explosions, their nuclear site, one of their nuclear sites. I would argue you've got another book already ready for you, right?
Well, indeed. As you know, for your listeners who may not have heard it, the Russians are testing a nuclear-powered missile. I'm not sure exactly how that would work, but anyway, it blew up and killed 8 or 10 people, and now it turns out that they're worried about it, the contaminated place where it blew
radiation.
up. You know, and so, you know, these people they're busy.
Can you take a lot of the things that Russia is doing and almost say that China is using some of the exact playbooks?
Well, sure, and I think that's so true. China, of course, has their own problems, and one of which is that they've got a little revolution going on down in Hong Kong. And in the next few months, it's going to get squashed terribly, I'm afraid. I wrote a book called Hong Kong, and it came out in the year 2000. And the premise is just that a revolution begins in Hong Kong and sweeps on into mainland China.
So you started this thing. You started this thing then.
I'd love to take the credit. But anyway, this was the rebellion against against communism is in China is really been the bugaboo of the ruling class, the communists, because one suspects that exactly what will happen if there is a rebellion. All the communists are either going to be hung or shot, and there's no two ways about it. You know, they're going to go to the wall, so they're going to fight to the last ditch to prevent, you know, another revolution in China.
Well, we have an awful lot of Chinese, otherwise oligarchs, that have left the country and moved an awful lot of money out of China too. So it is, in a lot of ways, the same playbook of what is happening in Russia. On this newest book, The Russia Account, how much research and how much time did it really take you to write this, other than probably 10 minutes with a bowl full of cereal?
Well, it took a lot more than that. It took about 8 months of actual writing. And, of course, I did a good bit of research as to how money moves around the world, and had a lot of skull sessions with various people that know a lot more about it than I do. And but putting the plot together and writing and trying to make it a good, interesting read took 8 months, and turned it in. And of course, the book was due before I finished it, as usual. I'm always late, so publishers always know that, so they don't get too excited.
Did the book end differently than you think of where you were going to start with it? No,
I always knew where it was going. You know, the climax is the resolution of the main conflict. And I'm so old-fashioned, I think you have to know your climax before you start. And that is how that is the destination of this adventure. And so when we get to the climax, we want the reader to say, well, you know, I'm surprised that it ended this way, but upon reflection, this is the way this story should have ended. And so I don't want you to figure it out in chapter 5 and then flip to the back and say, aha, that's exactly the way it ended. And I want it to come as a surprise. And that's just storytelling. That's the craft. And so, but anyway, you can't start unless you know where you're going.
When you write your thrillers, Stephen, do you probably don't need an outline so much anymore, but because you're so experienced at this, do you have a certain kind of a guide that you follow, that you pick a topic that you've got to go to certain experts? I mean, do you have all of these contacts and locations to go to put some good thrillingness to the books?
Well, I think I work awful hard at doing the research to give it the flavor of authenticity, and so I have to reach out to people that know more than I do. And in the past, before the internet really got cooking, I had to spend a lot of time in libraries, and that the internet has really shortened that part of the job down. Now you can find so much information on the internet; it's scary. And
it is scary.
All you got to do is sit there and ask the right questions, and the answers come pouring out. Some of the answers are wrong, but part of the fun is trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong and run it by experts to see what they think. But it is a lot easier to research subjects like international finance that I don't know much about to start with now than it used to be.
Do you issue FOIA requests, Freedom of Information requests, in order to give you some basis of chapters in your books?
No, I've never done that. I'm not a reporter, and I'd rather sit back and figure out or try to decide why would that happen, and how would that get me to where my climax that I want to get to. And in other words, I put together a plausible story, and what actually happened in real life is not that important to me. And we're going to tell the story my way to make it come out the way I want it to come out. To entertain you.
So it needs to be a movie. You need to be a movie.
Well, they made a movie of my first book, Flight of the Intruder, and they never got around to make it anymore. Though I've had some of my titles used by the movies, and I had at least one plot that was sort of stolen. But it's what do they say? The only ism Hollywood understands is plagiarism. But anyway, you just go on, write your stories, and I'm making a nice living. I'm having fun. I entertain a lot of people, and I entertain myself. And so I got no complaints. I got the best job in the world.
Yeah, I think you do. And I might have the second best one, getting a chance to talk with you on all of this. So do you actually give any kind of lectures on any of your books, Stephen?
Well, I talk about writing, and I have to various groups, and I've been doing that for a lot of years. Everything from the Rotary Club, Lions Club, veterans groups, Civil Air Patrol, and I even did a 6th grade class one time. So anyway, I've talked to anybody that wants to invite me. I usually give away books. I don't charge. I think the fact that I don't charge a nickel gets a lot of people interested in inviting me. So I do as much of it as I can, remembering that my wife and I have a life, and I also have books to write.
What kind of help? Does she give you any kind of help, or is she just patient?
Well, she reads everything I write. And so at the end of the day, I'll give her what I've written that day, and she reads it. And every now and then she has a suggestion. And she also occasionally corrects my grammar. And, I was really lucky. I never got worse than a B in grammar all the way through the 8th grade. That's supposed to be funny.
I get it. But the way education is today, I think that you're probably still ahead of the curve if you grade all of that. You bring in a lot of intelligence components into your stories. Tell us why you do that.
Well, I was looking for the publishers through the years have always wanted Jake Grafton and as a main character, and they like him, and they say the public follows Jake Grafton. I've written, this is my 24th solo novel. And I was figuring up this morning, 19 of them feature Jake Grafton. There's five of them that don't. But anyway, they want a Jake Grafton story. What could Jake do that he's in that would put him in the thriller business? And he can't continue to be a naval officer. And so finally I got him into the CIA and I promoted the heck out of him. And, and he ended up being the director. And so that gave him a position that I could use him as a character in various thrillers. His sidekick is a burglar who was told he would have to join the CIA or go to jail, and that's Tommy Carmelini. And Tommy and Jake have been a pair for 9 novels. This is the 9th major novel with those two. And Tommy tells his side of the story in the first person. And I tried that. The first book I tried that with was called Liars and Thieves. Mm-hmm. And I thought it worked out pretty well. And it stunned some readers. It sort of jolted them at first. And then they got used to it. And now nobody even mentions it. And so, but anyway, Tommy will tell his part of the story in the first person. And I use a third for Jake's part. And so that works out pretty well. I have fun writing Tommy. He's young and hip and they're ready to get in trouble all the time. And Jake is the, adult influence.
Gasoline in a match.
Yeah.
So when people are asking for autographs, are you signing either Tommy or Jake?
No, I signed Stephen Coontz. But, I did one book, Denise, years ago called The Garden of Eden. And it's not a thriller. It was just a contemporary, sort of a funny story. And anyway, a publisher, I maneuvered them into publishing it, but they got cold feet right at the end and they said, we can't put your name on it. I said, oh, why not? And he says, if we put this book out with your name on it, it says, you'll never sell another book in America as long as you live. And I thought, you really? And so anyway, they said, we want a pseudonym, a pen name. And so I thought about it and thought, well, if you're changing genres, you might as well change genders. So I said, how about Eve? The Garden of Eden by Eve. And they said, that's too cute. And I thought about it and says, okay, The Garden of Eden by Eve Adams. Adam and Eve? You get it?
Eve Adams.
Said, that's still too cute. And I said, well, what do you want? Jennifer Jones, And so they thought it over, and so it became The Garden of Eden by Eve Adams. And they made a big deal out of it. Wouldn't tell anybody who wrote it and all that. And it went out. They didn't put any money. They advertised in it either. So it never went very far. But I told my publicist at the time that if I was ever asked to do a book signing for that book, I was going to shave my legs and get a plus-size dress and go as Eve Adams and sign, all my autographs, Eve Adams.
Yes.
And he thought about that a little bit. And he said, I'd like to see that. But anyway, it never happened. Nobody ever asked me to do a book signing that book, which is sort of good, I guess. But anyway, I write stories, and some of the stories I write aren't thrillers. And Denise, I don't know whether you've ever seen them, but I wrote 3 semi-sci-fi books called Saucer, The Conquest, and Saucer, Savage Planet. And they all did fairly well. The first one was a bestseller, and the Brits love that stuff.
Wow, yeah.
The Brits like funky stories. The little, the Peter Pan and J.R.R. Tolkien's Hobbit stuff, and not to mention the Rowling and Miss Rowling's stories about the boy wizard. So the Brits loved Saucer, and they wanted a sequel. So originally it was going to be one book, but the British wanted more, so I gave them a second one, then a third one. I thought, that's enough. 3's enough. And so there's not going to be any more Saucer books, but the people that found them love them.
If you were in a room with other, I would say like authors, James Patterson or Brad Thor, what would be your topics of discussion?
I don't know. The authors that I do know, we end up talking about publishers more than anything else.
Oh.
And, your adventures in publishing. And it could get very interesting. I'm on the book before this was published by the Capo. It was a history book that I wrote with aviation historian. It's called Dragon's Jaw, the story of how the United States spent 7 years bombing one bridge in North Vietnam, the Than Hoa Bridge, and finally knocked it down after 7 years. And we thought that was worth a history book, and so we just did that. That came out in May, Dragon's Jaw. Mm-hmm. And that's my first and last history book. You talk about research. Oh, my Lord. Novels are art, and history books, every comma, every fact, everything has
citation, bibliography. Yeah.
And we still got it wrong occasionally. So hopefully the paperback, when it comes out next November, will have all those little corrections that nobody will notice but Barrett and I.
When you look at some of the titles of your books, The Assassin, The Disciple, Pirate Alley, Under Siege, they all are in fact such thrillers, but again, there's always, I would say, some conspiracies attached, but a lot of those conspiracies end up having lots of truth to them. And, we see a lot of movies that do the same thing. I know if you watch the entire Godfather series, there was an awful lot of factual things in there. Does that make it easier when you are writing your thrillers?
Well, I think that, we're all struggling to try to give it that verisimilitude, that air of reality that makes fiction work. Even Shakespeare worked. His kings and queens come across as kings and queens, but believe me, William Shakespeare never met any. And but he worked hard to give it that aura of reality, the plausibility. It could, King Lear could have been like this, and so on. And and so he's entertained people for over 400 years.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with the best-selling author, Stephen Coontz. His newest release is The Russian Account. Congratulations on the continued good work. It's been a distinct pleasure chatting with you, and best of luck in this new release.
Well, thank you, Denise. It's been a pleasure to be on your show.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way, so stay with us.
You can't handle the truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie, 4 Tree 5, 9er 21. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie, 47 Tree 9er, 8 9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEVT, gas TOT 5
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And thanks for staying with us, ladies and gentlemen, the Denise Simon Experience. We're going to trot on over to tipping points. got the distinct pleasure of having Miss Tipping Points herself, Liz Wheeler, with us, who is the host of Tipping Points on One America News Network. And she has just introduced her new book, Tipping Points, How to Topple the Left's House of Cards. Goodness, Liz, thanks for the just constant, enduring, limitless good work that you're doing, and for writing this book. I'm thinking that what you're really doing is trying to mobilize some deputies out here to help out with stopping the left.
You got it. Denise, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's so great to be here. But I think you nailed it about my book. That's exactly what it is. I tell people it's a handbook. My hope is that when you read this, once you put it down, you feel empowered to take part in this fight. Because I think so often, and I get tons of emails from people every day after my show talking about this, telling me, listen, I agree with what you say. I hear the stories you're telling. I see what the radical left is doing. But how do we actually stop them? Because they're making such a concerted effort to impose their ideology on us. How do we stop them? And so my book is my answer to those emails. This book is a how-to guide for how me, everyday Americans can take part in this fight, debunk the lies the left tells us every day, and defeat their ideology.
It's not only lies, but they're kind of like, they're concocting stuff that plays on emotions. So let me ask you this, Liz. What is a typical day like for you? I mean, do you just kind of listen to some of these things and you either find yourself talking to the TV or, taking notes? Tell me what a typical day is like for you that you wanted to write this book.
Yeah, so my inspiration for this book is because this is what I do every night on my show. I mean, my show's an hour every night, Monday through Friday on One America News Network. And what we do is we focus on the stories that the mainstream media refuses to cover. We call it our underreported story segments. Mm-hmm. We tell you facts and numbers and proof and history that the left wants to ignore because it contradicts their ideology or their political agenda. We also take lies that they tell, whether these are lies about gun control, whether this is a lie about the history, our history, about Christopher Columbus. We take all the lies that the left uses to bolster their political agenda and we debunk them. So this book is a long-form version of what I have done every day on my show for the past 4 years since we started. It is telling you the truth, telling viewers the truth, giving viewers the information that they need to combat this web of lies that the left builds. And I have the advantage, of course, because this is what I do for a living, because this is my job. I spend my day reading and researching and writing. And not everyone has, the free time, the advantage to be able to do that. So I put in 6 or 8 hours of work before the show even starts to be able to condense it all into these 6 to 8 minute segments that we, the different stories we talk about within the space of an hour. This book is the culmination of that. This book takes all the most frequently peddled leftist lies, their talking points, their policy positions, and unpacks them, debunks them, tells you the truth, and tells you why everything that the left is built their platform on is a lie.
Don't you find it almost exhausting, however, because they do take things out of context, they step over a fact that's right there in their face, and then we have to work so hard at putting things back together again, even if that's possible. And I find it a compliment for you, and I would certainly echo the sentiment that Politico magazine named you a titan of conservative media. I think you've earned that title because of the work. Well, because of the work that you have to do. I mean, it is
hard work. It definitely is hard work. It's not just sitting there behind your keyboard on Twitter, having a fight with a friendly leftist or an unfriendly leftist. Yeah, it's a ton of work. And of course, anything that's hard work is tiring. But that's what's so great about working in our industry, Denise, is it's so fulfilling. You never feel like you've worked a day. You never feel like you've worked so hard and are so tired for no purpose, which I think that there are a lot of jobs that people don't feel fulfilled in. A lot of jobs, they don't feel like their work is going to any higher purpose. I'm blessed to work in a position where I feel like I'm fighting for the greater good. So when it is tiring, I feel like the fight is worth it. Going back to what you said before about how every time the left steps over a fact, or every single time they misconstrue or ignore context, in one of the chapters in my book, I believe it's chapter 10, I talk about how the mainstream media operates, because I think that's one of the most exhausting parts of the whole thing, is the mainstream media goes to bat every single time. They are in the pocket of the left. The left relies on them the mainstream media to further their lies. And so I talk about how we, as viewers or as people who don't want to watch the mainstream media because they lie, how we can identify the strategies that the mainstream media uses. I call it the mainstream media bias framework. It's 6 steps that the left uses, 6 steps the left takes for every single story. And these are the steps they use to insert their bias into the story. And once we recognize what those 6 steps are, it's almost a shortcut or a fast track for us to be able to say, wait a second, here is where you're lying. This is what you're doing and why, and you got to stop. And it helps us derail their lying before the narrative gets out of control.
I have this dream, and maybe you do too, and you're closer to it than me since I'm just in radio land. And that is that some moment you will step onto the set of CNN or The View uninvited, where you're there, you're on camera.
You mean crash the set?
Yes. Photobomb the thing.
I'm not going to do that, but I will tell you what I'll do. When they do spew egregious lies, when they do peddle dangerous conspiracy theories, I mean, they have to know that's not going to come without rebuttal
a challenge.
from me.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
without a challenge. I'm going to put the facts out there. I'm going to call them out for the lies that they tell. I'm going to explain to my viewers, the people that watch my show, people that see my clips online on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, I'm going to tell people what the lies are and how they can debunk them themselves. And I think that makes the mainstream media fear conservative media, as they should.
I also have this vision that Donald Trump someday is just going to walk onto, an MSNBC set with, Secret Service preceding him, and the whole place just stops and just wants to say, let's put some things in context. Let's put some real facts on the table. Let's have this, what they like to say, a national conversation. If you have a dispute or an argument or a debate with somebody on the left, who would you choose?
Oh, who would I choose to debate?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great question. I would debate any one of the 2020 presidential contenders, Democrat presidential contenders, any one of them. I would challenge on their policies. I mean, you saw those debates. You watched those Democratic debates. I'm sure you did. I'm sure your viewers did. It was about 175 hours of torture. It was terrible. But everything they said, I mean, it could so easily be contradicted. Nobody on that stage would contradict each other. The moderators wouldn't hold them accountable for their history, for their lives, for the narratives that they were spinning. I would love to I invite, in fact, any of those presidential contenders to come on my show, have the tough conversation, try to convince me of your policy. I'm open to being convinced if you have the facts. I don't think you do, but come on and we'll have a debate. We'll have a conversation about it.
There's such a slew of questions that I want to ask these candidates that are not going to be easy questions. Certainly, they would be distinct to each of them given their roles in politics. And I think that, CNN, well, I don't think we know that CNN is being way too easy on them. And we want to talk about, the hot buttons of immigration, which is they've turned into an emotional issue instead of a lawful issue. Same thing with healthcare, and the healthcare thing, along with climate change. So we got immigration, climate change, and healthcare. Those are the only 3 things they want to talk about. Is that right, Liz?
Yeah, I mean, today is actually the narrative today from the left on immigration is a perfect example of the deceitful rhetoric from the left. So the Trump administration, as I'm sure you heard, is implementing a new rule that says that legal immigrants, people who are here legally but not permanently, they have a visa, they will be denied permanent status if they are dependent on government welfare. If they're on food stamp programs, if they rely on Medicaid, if they have housing vouchers, if they are a public charge, it's called under the verbiage of the statute. If they are a public charge, then they will be denied permanent status. And likewise, this new rule from the Trump administration would deny entry to our country to potential immigrants who are deemed to be likely to be public charges. So there's nothing controversial about that. That's very normal. The left is saying it's xenophobic. The left is saying it's anti-immigrant. And that's the sort of the pervasive narrative around this today. You know, the left is invoking the Statue of Liberty and accusing the Trump administration of racism. But I talk about tactics in my book, and that can be applied to this situation today. The only thing you need to do to debunk this narrative, Denise, today that the left is purporting is ask them this rule that the Trump administration is introducing. They're enforcing an existing law. Under what administration was this law passed? The answer to that question is the Bill Clinton administration. This was passed by a Democrat administration. So you ask them, was it racist and xenophobic and anti-immigrant when Bill Clinton did it? And if so, why didn't you call it out? And it just demonstrates the deceitful narrative that is coming from the left when you're able to take their narrative and, you know, turn it around and put them on the defense.
Do you have a team that's helping you with some of these things to debunk? Because often when I try and do the same thing myself, I feel like I could have an army of people here.
I wish. I do have a great team of producers that helps me put on my show. I have a booking producer and a producer that does the elements, and producers that are the liaison in the network with Master Control. I do the research and the arguments preparation myself. So it's a ton of work, and it certainly could be the work of an army. But that part I do myself for my show, and I'm really proud actually of the fact that I wrote every word of my book myself. I did the project myself. I know a lot of people in the public eye hire ghostwriters, and I'm not here to knock that per se. They can do what they want. But I'm very proud that I wrote this myself because I really wanted to communicate directly to my viewers, to your listeners. I really wanted people to feel like it was me talking to them. I wanted to make the point that I knew needed to be made. And the only way that I could do that was if I wrote it myself. And so I did.
I would say, Liz, if you've got a fire in your belly and you feel it all with such a passion, then it's not really hard to write, is it? And the reality and the genuineness comes out, correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's always hard work. There's a lot of work that goes into it, but the motivation to do it, I would agree with you exactly. If you have that, if you have that fire in your belly, you have that innate desire to defend life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the foundational principles of our country, then you don't mind the hard work because it's meaningful, because what you're doing impacts other people. It protects other people. It increases the quality of life of other people. And at the end of the day, if you can, just as human beings, if we can do work that is for the greater good, I think we find fulfillment even when it's tiring.
You mentioned the word liberty. And I would say liberty and freedom are two words that we never hear from the left. I always listen for, and I learned this when I watched the O.J. Simpson trials years ago. I was watching for what was not introduced, what was thrown out, what is not said, what is not argued. And I look for those things in these candidates, not just in these candidates, but also in existing politicians that are sitting in both houses. What is missing from their speeches or their stump appearances? Do you do that, Liz?
I do. And you want to know what word was completely missing from the Democrat debates that I thought was absolutely striking? Because this single word, this single institution in our country is the answer to most of our cultural ills, most of our cultural problems. You want to know what that word is? Family. The Democrat presidential contenders did not mention the word family as the solution to any of the problems facing our culture. They talked about mass incarceration. They talked about drug use. They talked about gang life. They talked about poverty. They talked about healthcare. They talked about jobs. They talked about education. Not a single one of them mentioned the fact that the best protector against poverty is the family unit. The best indicator of whether a young person is going to join a gang or use drugs or commit a crime is whether they have an involved father, whether their parents are still married, whether they have that stability in their home life. Not one of the presidential contenders mentioned the word family, and yet they have all these governmental so-called solutions to problems that could be fixed if we just promoted strong families.
It's the very foundation of pretty much everything, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, I know that makes me sound like an old person to preach on that, but it's
careful now.
If you read history, If you look at, societies that have failed and societies that have been successful, if you even look at different times in our country that we've suffered from cultural problems more than others, the times that we have strife are the times when family is not valued, and the times that societies have success is when the family, when married moms and dads raise their kids. Those are the places that are the most successful, the least poverty, the lowest crime rates, the highest education quotas. All of those different things really does come back to the family.
What would you expect any of the left to say if Liz Wheeler said, can you just leave all of us alone out here? We want limited government. Why don't you help us achieve that? What would you expect their answers to be?
Well, this doesn't even have to be hypothetical. I know what their answer is. When I say that we want limited government, they tell us we've given the free market a chance and the free market has failed. That's what they tell us. It's not true, but that's what they tell us because they want to use that as an excuse for government to take over. That's actually the same reason why they ignore the family. In fact, they don't just ignore the family, they attack the family, because what happens when you don't have strong family units is individuals don't rely on their families anymore. They have to rely on the government. So it doesn't matter who the left scapegoats, whether they say the free market has had its chance and it has failed, now the government must take over. Their ultimate goal is government control, and they're going to go after that one way or the other.
If we said to any of them, I mean, you're giving us techniques here, certainly debating techniques. One word that I would like to put in there is that we resent their intrusions. Where do you think that would go in a technique using against them?
I think we have to show examples of what we mean. I mean, sometimes words can be a little empty, but if you want to talk about an intrusion, we can talk about what happens under a Medicare for All system. I mean, this isn't hypothetical either. You can look at other westernized nations who have government-run healthcare systems. You can look at what happens in the UK, for example. Children, these are little children with cystic fibrosis, are being denied life-saving medication by the government solely on the basis that the government doesn't want to pay for it. I mean, you want to talk about an intrusion into your personal life. You want to talk about government having the power to decide whether your child lives or dies. I mean, I don't know a single person, Republican or Democrat, who actively wants that here. And when I say a single person, I mean a single voter. I'm not talking about politicians. Nobody wants that here. So if we want to talk about resenting government intrusion, we have to give people examples of real life situations where government is getting too involved in our lives, making decisions that hurt our families, and why we need to protect against that.
We went through this part of where Elijah Cummings, congressman from Maryland, and the attack on Baltimore. But I think Baltimore into itself, a lot of people like to use Venezuela, and that's okay too. But Baltimore is here. Baltimore is a full-blown symbol of throwing money at a problem, no oversight, no checks and balances, and what do we have? So they don't want to talk about Baltimore, do they?
No, they don't, for one very simple reason. It's run by Democrats. I mean, you look at the last 3 mayors of Baltimore have either resigned or been thrown from office in disgrace for corruption, and they were all Democrats. So in order to call out this problem, Democrats would have to point a finger at themselves, and they're at the point politically in our nation that they hate the president. They hate President Trump so much that they would rather people in Baltimore suffer than take any blame on behalf of members of their own party for running Baltimore into the ground. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the Democrats and where their interests lie, whether or not they actually care about the people they represent, I don't know what else does.
Liz, President Trump mentioned for a little while restoring law and order, and I was very, very happy to hear that, but suddenly it's gone away. And I think that he needs to reintroduce that law and order, certainly when it comes to things like immigration. Is that a realm of discussion that he needs to have again to kind of rein in some of this nonsense that is happening in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good rhetorical strategy for him. I think he hasn't stepped away from enacting that law and order mindset in policy. I mean, even what we were talking about before, the rule that the White House is implementing that is essentially enforcing an existing law on the book that says if immigrants are dependent on government, then they can't remain here permanently. I mean, that is literally law and order. That is enforcing a law that's on the book. That is the job of the executive branch after all. And you know, if Congress doesn't like that, they can change the law. But President Trump is acting in accordance with the law. He is enforcing the laws in the book. And I think that's why that's one of the reasons why Democrats are losing public opinion on immigration, because the president is so obviously just following and enforcing the law, whereas Democrats are the ones who are advocating for us not to even have any laws when it comes to immigration on our border.
Media, I would say, is the Democrat Party. I don't think there's any argument with that one. What if there should be a challenge to, hey, media, how come you're not talking about law and order? Where do you think that conversation would go?
I mean, the mainstream media networks are in the pocket of the left. They consider their job not to be reporting facts, not to hold the government accountable, but just to defend and protect the Democrat narrative. So they've certainly sacrificed their credibility. It's to the detriment of the American people, I think. They've sacrificed their role as that accountability arm for the government that's sort of in a constant criticism state of the government in order to help make everything better. I mean, I hold the mainstream media accountable frequently on my show. We do a segment every Friday called The 5 Stories the Mainstream Media Refuses to Report On, where we call out the mainstream media for not talking about things that the American people are interested in. And it's a wildly successful segment. The American people, who are the viewers of media, understand that the media engages in deceitful rhetoric and they don't like it. So I think the strongest way to hold the mainstream media accountable is for the people, the consumers, to either stop watching the mainstream networks or to give feedback, because ultimately the mainstream media is a business like anything else, and consumer feedback is key.
Well, you've built an army. And I can see that you're still recruiting and still mobilizing, and that's a very good thing, something that absolutely needs to happen. I have a lot of people that mention you to me, and so
I'd love to hear that.
Well, that's a fact. That's truly a fact. And you know, we are pretty desperate for some saneness, some logic, and I think we're clearly missing that. Ladies and gentlemen, please trot on over to Amazon.com, Tipping Points, How to Topple the Left's House of Cards. She's giving us arrows for our quiver, and I think that she's done the work for us. She's told us here on the Denise Simon Experience what we need to do, so the lessons are there to be learned. Miss Liz Wheeler, thanks so much.
Thank you so much,
very
Denise.
Humbled to have you with us, and just so appreciative of your good work.
Oh, thank you. That's so kind. I appreciate you being here on the show. People can go to Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, or in bookstores now to get my book. And I appreciate everybody who's bought it so far. I mean, a couple days after release, we were up to number 3 on Amazon's bestseller list in the political commentary category. That's quite exciting to see all these different people wanting to know how to defeat the left and doing something about it.
High five, Miss Liz, and thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience, ladies and gentlemen. There's more coming your way, so stay with us. And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us on the Denise Simon Experience. Socialism sucks. I would actually call it, where we are today, socialism chic. So I got the distinct pleasure of having Ben Powell with us. Ben and his co-author, Robert Lawson, have just published and released a book titled Socialism Sucks. They went on a beer tour and asked a lot of questions in countries and looked around in countries that were really unfree while they were having a few beers. Thanks, Mr. Ben Powell, for being with us and writing the book.
Hey, Denise, good to be with you, and it was a pleasure to drink my way through the unfree world most of the time, although sometimes it was downright unpleasant.
It had to be. You're a professor of economics at Texas Tech, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Let me start off this way. When you teach economics at Texas Tech, are you rather stunned at the students in your class that have no concept of economics because it really wasn't part of any syllabus in their public school system?
Well, I guess I'm kind of used to that anyway. I've taught at 4 universities for a number of years and have encountered this before. I will say that when you read about the young people being attracted to socialism and such, I don't get that vibe here in West Texas as much as I have when I've traveled around the country lecturing at other universities. Because West Texas tends to be a little bit more American individualist type people.
Mm-hmm. Is it kind of disappointing, though? I mean, on the bird's eye view that we could be our students, for I would guess at least a couple of generations are so lost.
Yeah, well, I think economics for many people is counterintuitive. Let's just sit down and study it. And unfortunately, I think all too often my colleagues are partly to blame. I don't mean here at Texas Tech, but I mean economists across the country of being boring. Economics is too important and can be too fun to be made boring. But a lot of people teach it that way, and students get turned off by it. Instead of talking about the real world and things that students can relate to and showing them how the economic way of thinking can make sense of an otherwise complicated and confusing world, which is part of the motivation for writing this Socialism Sucks, Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World book. Is myself or my co-author could have written any number of more scholarly journal articles that few normal people would ever read. Instead, we said, let's go get drunk around the world and we'll write it up kind of Anthony Bourdain style, except teach economics instead of food, and maybe we'll reach some more people than we would otherwise.
Good thought, because it does have some humor in it. And so, having a couple of beer glasses or beer, they're glasses, they're not Steins, on the cover actually adds a little bit of go grab this book and let's open up at least the jacket and see what it's about.
We had to work with the publisher on that a little bit. The publisher started putting these nice frothy big mugs of beer on the front, and I'm saying, this doesn't look like sucks to me. You're missing the sucks part. So that's why we've got the glasses shattering and the beer spilling on it too. But the beer actually, in addition to being like an honest account of how we travel, it ended up evolving into kind of a metaphor for how these different economies functioned in all of these different countries that we were in. What you could say about the alcohol would give a pretty good indication of how the rest of the economy was doing.
Good beer, imported beer, bad beer, price, quality, gave a lot of indications.
Yeah, sure. The quick rundown on this is, first out of the gate is Sweden. It's called Not Socialism. And Sweden's not a socialist country. It does have a big welfare state and high taxes, and I think there's problems with those, particularly how it slows down economic growth. But that's not socialism. Socialism is government ownership of the major factors of production that entails then centrally planning your economy. Sweden is a market economy. It's very economically free, top quarter of the world or so of countries in terms of economic freedom, but big welfare state, high taxes. Result, wonderful selection of beer, plenty of variety to choose from, but it costs a hell of a lot because they tax the bejesus out of everything. Now contrast that with Venezuela. Get this, Denise, the country ran out of beer. The entire country. So I don't know about you, but if I were a socialist dictator, I'd make sure like beer and toilet paper. These are the two things I wouldn't run out of. But Venezuela, what happened is Polar, their national monopoly beer distributor, the central planners didn't give it enough foreign exchange in order to import the barley to make the beer. As a result, you had a nationwide shortage of beer. Well, this is also mirroring what's going on in Venezuela's economy, where they have a nationwide shortage of food and other basic necessities. And, the average person lost 19 to 24 pounds last year in Venezuela, and it's not because they discovered Jenny Craig. And we could do this through lots of the countries that we traveled through, where the alcohol kind of reflects what's going on.
All right. So if I say it this way, socialism is the very opposite of capitalism. Is that a very simplified, accurate summary?
Sure. You could think of like kind of two poles on opposite ends of a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
One is pure capitalism, where everything's privately owned, and we use voluntary transactions in markets or in cooperation in civil society to allocate all resources. The other opposite pole would be socialism, where all of the major factors of production are collectively owned, which in practice means state-owned and state-controlled, and that your economy, rather than prices and profit and loss coordinating, a central plan does. Now, in either pure form, capitalism doesn't exist in any country around the world in its purest form today.
Right.
Hong Kong probably comes the closest, at least until these Chinese authoritarians crack down on it more. And then also, socialism in its purest form hasn't existed either. Probably Russia during the period of war communism in the early 1920s, or China during Mao's Great Leap Forward, they probably come the closest, and they're absolute human and economic disasters. But some of the countries today, Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, are pretty close to that socialism proper end of the spectrum. But all countries are kind of somewhere in between. You know, we have socialized industries here in the United States, but we're mostly capitalist.
Glad you went there, because that's actually where I was going to go next. And I would say, because we are, for the most part, the United States being built on a free enterprise, free market, capitalistic system, which it should, in fact, be. Historically, it was. We have gone through a very, I don't want to use the word nefarious, but I can't think of another one, kind of evolution on where we have taxation and government regulations and laws and everything that are chewing away at the boundaries of the free market capitalistic system, which now has given us almost a hybrid system. Certainly not that to the extreme of Russia or even the European Union, but we cannot overlook the fact that we have socialistic programs and I guess a government model that we cannot deny. Is that right?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and that it's got worse in the United States. I think the United States is still one of the more free market orientated economies around the world, but this is also kind of like being the tallest dwarf. Every country falls far short of the capitalist ideal. The United States, my co-author of the Socialism Sucks book, is also the co-author of the Economic Freedom of the World annual report that ranks all different countries. And historically, the United States was number 2 or 3 freest in the world in those rankings. But we fell all the way down to, I think, at worst, 18th a few years ago, as other countries became more free than the United States. And this has happened in partly because of the taxes and regulations that you talk about, but also destruction of private property rights and enforcing contracts in the United States. And it's a bipartisan affair, whether it was Republicans or Democrats in office. And I'm thinking of things like the Supreme Court Kelo decision, where you could take private property using eminent domain and give it to another private party. I'm thinking about the crony capitalism that was bailing out Wall Street and wholesale rewriting contracts during the Great Recession. Or even civil asset forfeiture, where the police can seize property out of your car or your car itself if they simply suspect of it being involved in a criminal activity without actually charging you. I think all of these things are erosions away from a free market system here in the United States, particularly with the property rights, but the taxing and regulating as well.
Well, we have healthcare. We have got the entitlement program, housing. We've got education that I would also argue is really a socialist education. So, Social Security, Medicare, and then we have these laws that have these addendums to them, or these regulations that are added to them. So we are heading to a frontier that is going to be very hard to unwind if it's ever unwound. And I would argue between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and, some of the rest of them, they're not being challenged on any of this. Is that right, Ben?
Yeah, I think the Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, they're not going to all of a sudden nationalize your companies and make us a socialist country overnight. But both of them are going to push you a little farther down this road to serfdom and away from capitalism. And I think you're absolutely right that when we look at industries like education. It is largely government ownership and provision of K through 12 education in the United States. With healthcare, it's nominal private ownership, but the regulation and control is so extensive that it's far from a free market operating there. And housing, well, it's private property that's owned. Government land use regulation now, particularly at the local level rather than the national, is severely curtailing what can be done with it. And I don't think it's an accident that when we look around and say what's getting unaffordable in the United States, in a lot of areas it's housing, and everywhere it's healthcare and education. And it's the government mucking up the markets in these places.
Is there one particular domestic industry that is most susceptible or vulnerable to some of the more socialistic policies in the United States that you see?
Well, I mean, if we take the literal definition of socialism, government ownership and control of the means of production, it would certainly seem like K through 12 education is there at this point. In most other places, it's a severe regulating of the economy that's nominally private. But you know, when you see the crony capitalists out there, when things go bad, they're always looking for handouts. So many industries, we saw it in the banking industry and Wall Street during the Great Recession, and or for that matter, when we saw government motors get their bailout. Yes. The free market system is a profit and loss system. It doesn't work unless you make people suffer the losses when they destroy value for others. That's how the market self-corrects.
We have the European Union. How old is that? 40 years old? I forget now when the European Union was established. And I would say that therein lies where all of the members of the European Union submitted, and they just said, okay, we'll give all of our judicial system and our governance and our economic programs over to a set of bureaucrats that don't understand the distinction between France and Portugal, for instance. So there should have been some set-in panic, and people like Ben Powell and Robert Lawson were likely watching all that and going, what are you guys doing? Were you guys watching the European Union, which is trying, I would say, with the Brexit movement, trying to get some of that back, unwinding it?
Yeah, Bob and I have both individually traveled extensively in Europe, but for the purposes of this Socialism Sucks book, we didn't go there because it really wasn't full-on socialism. We went to Sweden just to illustrate that it's not socialism. But I do think that the European Union has been a mixed bag for some countries and a wholesale disaster for others. And, you know, with Brexit, it's not clear to me whether we're going to have a net freeing as a result of Brexit or not. It depends if they replace regulations from Brussels with regulations from Downing Street, then it's not really going to be a net freeing. And I'm not clear that the Brits were really against the regulation and the taxes. Rather, they were just against Brussels doing it to them. But for some Eastern European countries who are trying to get credibility in their reforms, part of them, some of them joining the European Union probably was a net freeing of their economy. For others, like I was sad when I saw Estonia join it because Estonia had made much more market-orientated reforms than the European Union was. And, you know, one place where we did go in this book, the last or second to last chapter in the book is called New Capitalism. And we went to the Republic of Georgia, which was previously part of the former Soviet Union. And they are not a member of the European Union, but have made dramatic free market reforms. They're now in the top 10 most capitalist countries in the world. For a while, they even surpassed the United States briefly. But they made almost no reforms for more than a decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then with the Rose Revolution in the mid-2000s, they got a radical free market reformist finance minister in there, along with the reformist president, Mikhail Saakashvili. And they slashed tax rates, fired entire bureaucracies, went to transparent privatization of state property by having online auctions, dramatically turned the country around. And Georgia's been booming ever since. It's still relatively poor because it was very poor to start with, but it's been growing rapidly and is changing by the day. Also, interestingly enough, reflected in their alcohol industry. Georgian wine is very good. And Georgia traditionally produced wine during the Soviet times because the Soviet central planners were commies, not idiots. They understood that warm Georgia would produce wine better than, say, Siberia. But they planted international grapes, that we're all familiar with, Merlots, Cabernets, and such, on farmland, and mass-produced swill. Since the economy's become capitalist, all that's got torn up because no one wants to drink that stuff. And instead, they've replanted hill areas with traditional Georgian grapes, traditional winemaking styles, which involve a lot of time with whites crushing the stems and the skins with it, so it comes out like a golden color. It's fantastic wine industry and fantastic economy, all following very capitalist, non-EU style reforms.
How many countries did you and Bob Lawson visit?
Well, individually, we both traveled to more than 50 countries, probably. But for the course of this book, we went to Sweden, Venezuela, Cuba, Korea, China, Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, and then we finished it up back in the USSA by going to the largest socialist gathering in our country.
Chicago.
Yeah, in Chicago.
Was there one country or one event in a country that was more kind of in your blasting in your face than that was unexpected?
Yeah, I think probably the most dramatic in terms of and a little bit jarring that we saw was in Venezuela, and specifically actually on the bridges connecting Venezuela to Cúcuta, Colombia. These are the bridges, if you've seen on TV in recent months, where they tried to send aid trucks across and they were stopped. When we were there, those bridges were open. We were there in January of 17, and the people in Venezuela by the thousands every day were crossing over to Colombia to buy basic, and some of them were crossing over permanently to migrate. A few million people have left Venezuela. But thousands of them were crossing just to buy basic foodstuffs, toiletries, basic supplies that were completely unavailable in Venezuela. And what was striking was it wasn't witnessing, I don't know if this is the right term, but typical third world poverty. Bob and I have seen plenty of that in our travels, but this wasn't that. Instead, the truly impoverished Venezuelans weren't making it to the border to cross and buy things. These were middle-class, upper-middle-class Venezuelans who still had some savings, who had some access to money that they could come across and buy things that their own economy couldn't produce. Seeing them carrying, luggage that you'd expect to see in any major airport and how they were dressed was a clear indication that this was not, typical third world poverty, but that this is what happens to a relatively rich country. And remember, Venezuela was relatively rich. If you go back to 1970, it was pre-free market, and it had a higher average per capita income than Spain itself. Now, it had decades of stagnation before Chavez starts wrecking the place in 1998. But I guess that was jarring in as kind of a warning of what happens to a rich country if you adopt socialist-style policies. Then you see it going all the way up to the middle-class, upper-middle-class people, impoverishing them so that, like a couple that we talked to, they were on it took them 3 days to get there, and it was going to take them 3 to get back. They were on a 6-day grocery run in order to try to provide for their families.
Which I would say they'd have to do fairly often, wouldn't they?
They were making that trek, that particular couple, I think, every few months, but they said that they weren't sure if they were going to make it anymore because it was becoming too dangerous, because people would steal from you on your way back, including actually the Venezuelan police, as we saw when we were going back and forth across the border. They were completely uninterested in checking our passports, which is good since we didn't have a visa with us anyway, but they were interested in pilfering the things that Venezuelans were bringing back with them. So I think that was probably the most surprising second. The other one that's very stark is Korea. We spent time in South Korea, but then we went up to Dandong, China, on the North Korean border, and traveled up and down the Yalu River that separates China and North Korea. And this was not surprising, but it is still jarring. As you look across the river in North Korea, only a couple hundred yards, it's dilapidated, falling down buildings, just a pre-modern style economy. And this is even with their biggest export city, their main trade city, into China. And then just gazing a couple hundred yards in the other direction to China, you have skyscrapers going up, you have 6-lane highways, you have trucks whizzing by. Discontinuities like that are not natural. They're caused by these lines politicians draw on maps and the differences of policies between them. And, North Korea is about as bad as it gets. China is certainly not as fully capitalist as it gets. China's crony capitalism, but crony capitalism is still a hell of a lot better than state socialism.
How many individuals did you, have some discussions with in your travels, say in Sweden or in South Korea or even Cuba? Were they all pretty much saying the same thing or telling stories that, echoed the last story?
No, I mean, from country to country, they certainly didn't. Each country had different stories, and I don't know how many scores or hundreds of people we talked to. Partly because sometimes we did it in bars and you'd forget some of it, but it was different stories in each place. Cuba, you have to be a little bit more careful about talking overtly with political things unless they bring it up to you, because they're still at fear of their own government on that. But I'll tell you, one of the more striking ones I got from a Cuban was a university student who, in finding out that we were from the United States, immediately his first reaction, and this was during the time that the travel restrictions were a little bit lighter towards Cuba, although it doesn't matter for Bob and I because we're academics and can go for, quote, research, which originally Bob wanted to get drunk in Cuba, which was part of the start of this book. But the university student there, he said to us, he said, "Oh, from America." He says, "It's great. When people from America come, you bring us a little bit more," and we both know the next word he was going to say, a little bit more money, right? But no, he said he'd bring us a little bit more freedom. And it was this idea that, with exchange, I think whether in trade and goods across borders or exchange and travel, in moving between places, it helps cross-pollinate ideas. And the ideas of freedom are powerful. And I think if we wanted to help Cuba, instead of having an embargo against them and travel restrictions on U.S. citizens, I think we should open up with them, trade with them more. And as we trade with them and travel, I think it'll help spread the ideas of freedom even more there. Because people in Cuba are not unaware of what the outside world is, and for that matter, how their relatives live in Miami compared to how they live there.
Is there a particular culprit? I mean, do we have a United Nations ethos that is perpetuating this problem, or is it the International Monetary Fund, or is it Davos, or is it some other kind of global entity that is perpetuating it, manifesting it, or ignoring it?
Yeah, no, I don't blame socialism on some global entity. Socialism is an idea that has appeal to people, and that ultimately this is really an intellectual battle that we have to get people to not aspire to this, because once they start by aspiring to it, it becomes the authoritarian regimes that they can't get rid of, or they have a very hard time getting rid of. And I don't think the International Monetary Fund or the UN, either of them is a force for much good. They're probably more negative than they are positive. But, the IMF actively screws up economies all around the world and has for years. The darn organization should have been abolished in the 1970s when they got rid of the fixed exchange rate system that it was managing, but it keeps morphing itself into something else. Although I can think of a few instances where countries were so petrified of having to get an IMF bailout that they reformed themselves so they wouldn't have to deal with the damn organization. But in any event, I don't think we explain socialism by these international organizations, even if they, and sometimes, some of these African regimes and such, we'd be better off taking away the aid that keeps some of these regimes in power and letting them fail. But I don't think that's the main story with North Korea, Cuba, or Venezuela.
Who needs to read Socialism Sucks?
Everybody listening to your show.
Found on Amazon.com, by the way.
Found on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. Socialism Sucks. Two economists drink their way through the unfree world. If you're interested in history, economics, politics, but want to do it without reading graphs or having math or being boring, come along. It's kind of Anthony Bourdain meets Milton Friedman style economics. We drink, we cuss, but we tell the story. But it's still a deadly serious topic. And we teach the history and the economics of it in the process of having the best time we could in those travels.
As a professor of economics, when you have your students in the round, if you will, Do you get to a certain point in your syllabus where you see the expressions on their face change and a light goes off and just say, wow, they get it?
Well, hopefully you do that on the first day by talking about something that they thought they understood and then turning conceived wisdom on its head, and then you hook them so that they want to pay attention for the rest of the semester. So hopefully it's a continual journey like that.
Well, I'm old, and I remember Colonel Beechner was my economics teacher in the 7th grade, and I never had an economics class after that was mandatory. It was always an elective. And I would say therein lies the problem with education. If a lawmaker decided to introduce a bill that says socialism is to be unlawful in the United States, what would happen?
I don't think this is a matter of passing a bill. I think this is more of an issue for public intellectuals and intellectuals to join the conversation and talk to everyday people and make them better understand how a free market system operates and what's wrong with the socialist system. Politics is the problem. It's not going to be the answer.
I like the answer. I'm hoping that there's more of these discussions, especially as we enter into the general election in 2020. I'm very surprised that so many people that attend these political town halls are not challenging the Bernie Sanders and the Elizabeth Warrens of the world, to put them back on their heels. I'm not seeing that being challenged enough. Are you?
No, I think we need to challenge them more, especially when Bernie throws around the word socialism, or when Elizabeth Warren wants some public stakeholder on corporate boards and all of these other crazy ideas.
As does California.
But this is a job for more economists to step up and try to communicate these ideas clearly.
Ladies and gentlemen, grab this book. I think there's some big tools in here that Ben Powell and Robert Lawson are trying to give us, put some arrows in our quiver. Socialism sucks. The economists drink their way through the unfree world. Congratulations on this. Thank you for your time, and thanks for all the work that you've done.
All right. Thank you, Denise. Cheers.
Cheers. And ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. See you again soon.